بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Tonight we're going to pick up where we left off with Imam al-Buhuti rahimahullah ta'ala in his Umdatul Talib. We're looking at Islamic rules and I should say regulations for business transactions. And tonight we're going to look at a section that could be entitled Factors that Nullify Sales. Right? So at the top of the page that you've been given, it says Faslun, which is like a chapter. You could put next to that factors that invalidate sales. So you understand the objective of what we're looking at tonight. Imam al-Buhuti begins, he says, وَلَا يَصِحُّ البيع ممن تلزمه الجمعة بعد ندائها الثاني إلا لحاجة ويصح النكاح وسائر العقود. Okay, so we look at the translation there. It says, a sale is not valid from one who is obliged to attend Friday prayer after the second call to prayer, except in cases of need. Okay, إلا لحاجة is a haja as a need. Al-darura I would translate as a necessity or a dire need. However, marriage and all other contracts remain valid. So if we look at this in a little more detail and add some meat, if you will. So the sale is not valid even here for small items. You're selling even small items from one obliged to attend Friday prayer after the second call to prayer. The second call is the adhan al-thani, which is made end al-mimbar, next to the pulpit, if you will. Okay, this was the adhan that was made during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, as opposed to what they call al-adhan al-awwal, which is also al-adhan, which was the first adhan introduced during the time of Uthman radiyallahu anhu, okay, which is called prior to the second adhan. The second adhan is when the khatib stands up and he says assalamu alaikum, and then the muadhin calls the adhan. At that point, this is what we're looking at right now, not prior to that. Okay, so this prohibition extends, as I said, to both major and minor transactions. Even something as simple as purchasing water. And this applies universally, regardless of whether the buyer or the seller is the one required to attend Friday prayer. If one party is exempt from the buyer-seller transaction, the sale is still valid if the other is obliged to attend. So an exempt party, somebody not obliged to attend, like a traveler or a woman. Women aren't obliged to attend Salat al-Jum'ah. Engaging in the sale is discouraged for them. It's considered makruh because it facilitates a violation of the other party. So this should deliver kind of a concept here. Okay, that we are considering everything and everyone, not just the individual self. Well, I'm not obliged, so I'm going to keep on selling and everything will be fine. And if they stop and don't go to their prayer, well, then it's not my fault. They should have known better. No, it's a community. We live in a community, and in Islam, oftentimes the community has some level of responsibility over the individual, supporting each other either in positive behavior or negative behavior. And in this case, it would be a negative behavior to avoid an obligation or to be late to one. Essentially, the person exempt from Friday prayer will be facilitating a sin. Prohibition also applies to those living far from the masjid if they're still able to attend the prayer in time. And this could include the time that it takes for them to get to the prayer on time, even if that's before al-adhan al-thani. So if it takes them let's say 15 minutes to get to the masjid, then those 15 minutes prior to that, they have to stop engaging in transactions and trade. And this ruling is derived from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying in the Quran, إِذَا نُودِيَ لِلصَّلَاةِ مِنْ يَوْمِ الْجُمْعَةِ فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ. Right, when the call of prayer is made, this is Surah Al-Jum'ah, the call of prayer is made on the day of Friday, then proceed to the remembrance of Allah and leave trade, leave selling, buying and selling. And the prohibition is grounded in the fact that sales after the call to prayer distract people from fulfilling the obligation of attending Friday prayer, potentially leading them to missing the prayer or parts of the prayer. And as sales should end, all crafts and professions should also come to an end and are forbidden after the second call to prayer for those obligated to attend, as they also distract from prayer in a similar fashion. Meaning, your job might not be in sales. Okay? Your job is not in sales, and you're not out as a potential buyer. Your job is not a buyer, an acquisitions expert or specialist. Or you're not just off the clock and you're out buying stuff at the local corner store. But you're sitting behind a desk hammering away at the keyboard because you're a coder or you're an office worker. You say, well, I'm not in sales, and Allah says, وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ. Right? Leave off trade. Well, this is technically not bay', this is khidmah or something else, whatever you want to call it. No, all professions and crafts, there's no loophole you can find here because the obligation is to go and attend the prayer. So that's the overarching objective here, is to conclude things that would distract you from either making it entirely or being late to it in some fashion. Exceptions are made in cases of necessity. As was mentioned by Imam al-Bahuti, he says, إِلَّا لِحَاجَةٍ. When there is a need, like someone in dire need of food or drink. Okay, on the way, someone's out there posted up. The adhan's been called, but I need something. It's a need. It's a haja. It's not a durura like my life. It's not like life-saving situation. It's just I'm extremely thirsty. I'll be distracted sitting there, dry throat, dry mouth, whatever, or very hungry. I'm not going to die because of I'm being like emaciated or anything. But if there's a need, then the sale would be valid in these cases. Also, for someone that's not properly dressed and they need to purchase clothing, a garment to cover themselves in an appropriate manner, they can stop, they can make the purchase would be valid, and they can carry on. Or, mentioned by many of the imams and authors of such manuals, urgent burial supplies, or a shroud for the deceased that's required to prevent the body from spoiling. Meaning you can't delay the funeral any further. Right now you're in a severe need, and these articles and items must be purchased in order to facilitate an immediate burial. So in this case, the sales would be valid. Other essential needs like water for purification, etc., all these things are exempt from this rule because of the nature of the need. Much like a person that needed to get a ride. There's a transaction that may happen here. So the typical example is a person needs to buy an animal to now make their way to the masjid, if that's their only way to get there on time. But in modern day example would be, I'm already running late. I need to get an Uber or a Lyft, which is going to require me to make a transaction. So will I be sinful for that transaction? No, in this case, it's needed for you to get to where you're going, so the transaction is valid for you in this case. Other transactions that may be exempt are a transaction needed to ensure the safety and the welfare of another person, providing immediate help to someone's parent or sibling. Those types of things may be necessary. Somebody who is not obligated to be there or is in need, they have an urgent need for something to be purchased for their welfare or their well-being. Those types of things are going to be exempt there. The prohibition also extends to cases where the time for an obligatory prayer, besides Friday prayer, is so limited that delaying it for a sale would risk missing the prayer. Right? So when the prayer time begins to come to a close, you've got, let's say, 10 minutes left in order for you to perform the prayer on time. And there's a customer right in front of you. And engaging in that transaction is going to push you beyond that permissible window of time into a late prayer. Now the transaction is void. It's impermissible to conduct because you're going to miss an obligation based on this transaction. So this is similar to the Friday prayer, except that we're looking at a larger window of time for the other obligatory prayers. So like if someone delays Asr prayer until it's nearly going to expire, engaging in a sale during this very critical time is impermissible. However, if you have plenty of time or there's ample time to conclude the sale and then perform your prayer on time such that the prayer is performed within the window, not a part of it in the window and a part of it out of the window of time being late, then the sale's not prohibited. It's also something to be noted that some of the scholars discuss, or they insinuate of sorts, that if missing a congregational prayer in the inability to join another congregational prayer when the congregational prayer is deemed obligatory. There may be cases when it's not, but when it's deemed obligatory, and this is the general position of the madhab, is that congregational prayer is obligatory. Even if it means outside of the masjid, it might be congregational prayer at your home, where you have one other person to pray with, then you would be obliged to pray with them. So in the event that you delaying a sale, that you performing a sale at the cost of the at the congregational prayer, such that you couldn't get to another congregational prayer, then it's possible that engaging in this sale during this time is also prohibited. That's, they say, it's like ihtimal. It could be possible that because you're missing an obligation here. And then as he mentions, marriage and other contracts like rental agreements, like settlements, loans, pledges, similar agreements remain valid after the second call to prayer. And this is because the prohibition specifically targets sales, which are more distracting and likely to cause one to miss the prayer, whereas other contracts do not carry the same level of preoccupation, perhaps unless that's your trade. You have to stop your trade. If it's like a one-off, a quick call to the landlord, yes, extend my contract, extend the lease. It's not something that's recurring regularly. It's not something that's going to typically distract you from or cause you to miss or delay. Right? Those things can be done here or there, in front of or behind, before or after. The city has multiple masjids. This is another issue. And if you were with us during that section of the prayer in this book, you would note there was an issue about multiple masjids in one area and which jama'ah is the one that is valid. Without a reason, it's not permissible to hold more than one Friday prayer in a region without reason. If there's a valid reason, then it's possible. However, if it's not, more congregations shouldn't be held. So if you're in a city that has multiple masjids where Friday prayer is held, the prohibition applies from the call to prayer at the first masjid. So the first one that makes the adhan al-thani, that's when the time ends for sales. And this is to maintain the sanctity of prayer and avoid loopholes that might arise by delaying attendance due to differences in timing between masajid. Looking for, oh, they called, but the other one didn't call yet. I still got time for a Friday prayer, that is. All right, so that covers that section there. The next section, he says, وَلَا يَصِحُّ بَيْعُ زَبِيبٍ وَنَحْوِهِ لِمُتَّخِذِهِ خَمْرًا وَلَا سِلَاحًا فِي فِتْنَةٍ وَلَا عَبْدٍ مُسْلِمٍ لِكَافِرٍ إِن لَمْ يَعْتِقْ عَلَيْهِ وَإِنْ أَسْلَمَ فِي يَدِهِ أُجْبِرَ عَلَى إِزَالَةِ مِلْكِهِ وَلَا تَكْفِي كِتَابَتُهُ. Okay, so here's going to give us some very important principles to keep in mind. Okay, He says the sale of raisins or similar items to someone intending to produce wine is invalid, as is the sale of weapons during civil strife and the sale of a Muslim bondservant to a non-Muslim, unless the bondservant is freed upon purchase. If a Muslim bondservant converts to Islam while under a non-Muslim owner, the owner is compelled to relinquish ownership, and a mere contract of emancipation does not suffice. Powerful things here. So the first thing we look at is the sale of raisins or similar items. And we're talking about permissible items for sale, such as juice. Raisins, grapes, juice. You cannot sell them to someone intending to make wine. It's a permissible item, but it will be utilized for impermissible things. Are we understanding? Permissible item sold to someone who's going to use it for impermissible activity. This prohibition extends to all intended prohibited use. It's not just alcohol. It's all items intended for prohibited use. And this applies even when the buyer is a non-Muslim, because they're also accountable for adhering to the prohibitions of Islamic law. So, for example, selling cups, forget about the grapes and the juice for wine, selling cups or similar utensils to those who will use them to drink intoxicants is impermissible. Likewise, as he mentions, selling weapons, like a knife or a gun or a sword or a spear during civil strife to combatants or to highway robbers is forbidden. And this ruling is derived from Allah's command, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. It's a very general principle. Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 2, do not help one another in sin and transgression. And the prohibition applies even when the seller's knowledge of the buyer's intentions is based on circumstantial evidence. Meaning, they don't have to tell you outright, yeah, I want to purchase these grapes for my winery. In that case, it's explicit. I know that you're going to take these grapes to make wine. I can't sell you them. Think about the cake issue for the same-sex marriage that came up some time ago. They went to the bakery and they said, we want you to bake us a cake for our marriage, me and it was two men. And the guy refused. Rightly so, right? Because he's in support of something which is impermissible. It's not valid. He retains the right, of course, to refuse, the right of refusal. And in Islam, he's obliged to refuse in that case. But what about when it's circumstantial evidence? What would that include? That would include certain amounts, to purchase certain amounts of or quantities of things, or to inquire about how to utilize certain things in a certain way, such that the seller is aware of the commodity they have and knows that, look, if a person is buying this particular product in this commodity, it's typically used in this fashion. Or if the person is asking, so how would I mix these things together and combine these products? Like, if they're inquiring about certain things, and typically the seller, if they have enough experience, they understand how the commodity that they sell works and what the potential usage is. They didn't explicitly say, I'm going to do this. So, for example, you have a group of bandits or like a band of civilians that come, and it's in the middle of a fitna, and they are going to you as a gun dealer and they want to buy a bunch of guns. You know, like we're in the middle of some civil unrest, and these aren't officials, these don't represent the authorities. They're coming and buying all these guns. They have gang type, signs or affiliations of a mob or something. Then in that case, we can't sell you the weaponry because you're going to go out and you're going to get involved in this civil unrest. Okay, so those are the types of the type of circumstantial evidence that can be utilized in order to render this type of sale prohibited. It says the sale of a, however, selling like weapons when it comes to that to the rightful authorities, those that may be combating insurgents, or selling weapons to somebody defending themselves or their home, selling weapons to somebody defending themselves and their property is valid. Because in this case, you're supporting righteousness, you're supporting justice, as opposed to the opposite. Okay, so the general principle here, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. So you can think about that in terms of what it is that you're doing or going to possibly engage in. Is what I'm doing helping a sinful cause, supporting a sinful cause, or is it not? If it is, then you shouldn't do it. Think about the potential things out there that are sinful in and of themselves or could lead to some type of sinful behavior. And in that case, you say no. So if I'm a taxi driver and someone says to me, hey, I need a lift to the bar. Going for a party. You're going to have to say, sorry, I'm off duty. I can't take you to the bar. Because I'm taking you to some sinful thing. Not possible. That's the type of thought that needs to be in your mind with this general guideline here. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Do not help one another in sin and transgression. The next thing, which is another one of these factors that invalidate the sale, has kind of a different perspective, and that is the sale of a Muslim bondservant to a non-Muslim. This is invalid. A Muslim bondservant. All right, this is, for us, theoretical, but I think there's a very powerful foundation underneath this that we need to understand when it comes to other things in life. A Muslim bondservant, because we're not in a world where bondservants still exist, at least to my knowledge. So a Muslim bondservant, it's invalid to sell them to a non-Muslim, even if the non-Muslim acts as an agent for a Muslim buyer. This prohibition arises because such sales would prevent the continuation of ownership under Islamic guidance. Okay, so when we think about bondservants in Islam, the general idea is that freeing a slave is praiseworthy. And we saw that throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ. People would free slaves, and the Prophet ﷺ would tell them of an anticipated reward. Or he would tell them of the reward, and then they would go and free slaves. Or there would be some type of infraction they committed, and in order to make an atonement for that, they would free a slave or multiple slaves. So the idea is for people to be emancipated. However, as that was very prevalent during the time, the law of Islam came to regulate what was happening. So there is certain guidelines for someone who has a bondservant in terms of providing care and safety and security. Almost like a dependent of sorts, with specific rules. And so when that ownership is transferred to a non-Muslim, a Muslim is now subject to someone that will not apply those guidelines. So you would see something perhaps like what is American bondage or slavery, where only God knows the depravity that they had to suffer through. Okay, and this is similar, not exact, okay? So it's important to understand the word similar and not exact. This is similar to the prohibition of interfaith marriage, where a woman marries a non-Muslim man. So the Prophet ﷺ, so many of us are familiar with the explicit verses in the Quran about not marrying an idolater, and also the permission for Muslim men to marry women of the book if they're chaste. But there's no explicit rule that states and Muslim women are not to marry Christians or Jews or other faiths. It's just idolaters. It's explicit. But we can understand from the combination of these verses together the general concept of marrying someone of the same faith and having almost like an exception to the rule for a man to marry a woman of the book. And then the Prophet ﷺ saying, Al-Islamu ya'alu wa la yu'la alayh. That Islam is to be superior and not to be dominated or subject to anyone else. In that a Muslim woman should never be subject to a non-Muslim's authority as her husband. Right? Because in Islam, there's a framework that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has divinely commanded or has placed responsibilities on us as men and women, in that men are, what? Ar-rijal qawwamuna ala nisa. That the men, they act as the qawwam over the women. And we could define that in many different ways. However, the idea is that the man has to take a level of responsibility over the women in terms of direction of the household, etc. And enforcing the rules of Islam is the primary responsibility of the husband. And so and also the children are the husband's children. Right? When you have a child, what's the name of the child? The child takes the father's name. Does it not? We haven't gotten to a point yet, even in America, where the children are taking the mother's name. It's rare occasions, but as a general rule, even in American culture, children don't take their mother's name. They take their father's name. Okay, so we wouldn't want to have a Muslim woman in a position where not only is she subject to a non-Muslim man's authority, but she has to carry his children. Right? The Muslim woman, her honor and her dignity has to be preserved. So there's a similar principle here that we have to look at. Okay? So this is kind of the idea when it comes to a Muslim bondservant in such a relationship being sold to a non-Muslim. Okay, moreover, when it comes to that, it's forbidden to sell a male or female bondservant to individuals, even if they're Muslim, known for sinful activities. So if it's known that this person is going to involve that Muslim bondservant in sin, it's going to force them to behave in certain ways, like singing or entertainment purposes, then the sale is also prohibited. Whether it's a sale or it's a rental, these things are all prohibited. So again, the concept here about maintaining some level of morality in business transactions. So then some like details of this. If the Muslim bondservant is purchased by a non-Muslim and they will be automatically freed upon purchase, then that type of sale is valid. Like if the buyer is the bondservant's father, their son, or their brother, when they purchase them, they don't own them anymore because of the blood relation. So they become free. So that sale's valid because what? It supports the liberation and emancipation of a bondservant. Ownership does not persist in these cases. It does not continue, and so it's permissible to allow those sales to stand valid. If a Muslim bondservant converts to Islam while under the ownership of a non-Muslim, or if the non-Muslim acquires the bondservant through inheritance or similar means, the non-Muslim is compelled to relinquish ownership of the bondservant. Okay, again, that goes back to that concept of not being subject to something besides Islamic guidance. And this is also based on another general concept in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَنْ يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. Surah An-Nisa, verse number 141. And Allah will never grant the disbelievers a way over the believers, to be dominant over them. And then he concludes here and says that merely drafting a manumission contract for the bondservant, drafting, like this is the kitaba, drafting a contract for that servant to eventually be freed is not sufficient to fulfill this obligation of them relinquishing ownership, because it doesn't immediately transfer ownership away from the non-Muslim, or it doesn't immediately emancipate the the Muslim bondservant from the non-Muslim owner. And similar to that is selling a Muslim bondservant with an option for the buyer to return him. This is like khiyar. There, you give an option where you say, all right, we're going to sell this, and you got 30 days. 30 days. Like it, you keep it. If 30 days expires, sale's complete, no return. You got 30 days to return. Because here the same thing happens. It's inadequate because, even if it's a sale, it's inadequate because the potential is still there that they be returned to the non-Muslim. And it doesn't create a permanent severing of ownership here in this case. All right, so hopefully that's clear, and some of the underlying concepts we can think about and apply in different fashions. The next portion, he says, وَإِنْ جَمَّعَ بَيْنَ بَيْءٍ وَغَيْرِهِ بِعَقْدٍ صَحَّ إِلَّا الْكِتَابَةِ. Okay, so if a sale is combined with another type of contract in a single agreement, it is valid except in the case of an emancipation contract. So if a sale is combined with another type, like selling something and then having a rental agreement with it in a single transaction, it's typically valid. This would be like selling a bondservant and renting out a house for a single price. The sale and the other contract are valid. They say, I'm going to sell this and that for X amount of dollars. It's valid. Or I'm going to sell this and I'm going to rent that for X amount of dollars. That's a valid contract. However, if the combination involves a contract of emancipation, again, that's known as kitaba, such as emancipating a bondservant while simultaneously selling them a home for a total price, the sale's invalid. Like to the bondservant, you're going to sell them a home as well as the kitaba, their emancipation, in one contract. Say, I'm going to sell you the home, and you can buy your freedom for $1,000, I don't know, dollars. Let's just say it's an arbitrary number, $100,000. Okay, this is invalid because the seller of the home is effectively selling their property to themselves. Because the bondservant, they own. And if they sell the home to the bondservant, they own that. So this portion of the contract would be invalid. However, the contract of emancipation would remain valid for the proportion of the agreed price. Right? There will be a proportion. The house would be valued at X amount of dollars, and the emancipation contract would be valued at X amount of dollars, or a proportion. It might not be the exact number, but you could say this is 40% and this is 50% of a contract if lumped together at market value, even if it was sold under market value. And then, of course, there would be no legal impediment to consider this to be invalid in such a case. So the emancipation contract would be valid. The next part, he says, وَيَحْرُمُ بَيْءٌ عَلَى بَيْءِ مُسْلِمٍ وَشِرَاءٌ عَلى شِرَائِهِ وَصَوْمٌ عَلى الصَّوْمِ بَعْدَ الصَّرِيحِ الرِّضَى. It is prohibited to engage in a sale over the sale of a fellow Muslim, to purchase over his purchase, or to bid over his bid after explicit consent has been given. So here, again, we're looking at some level of morality and communal well-being in sales and in transactions. So it's forbidden to interfere with the sale of another Muslim. And this is stated in the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, do not sell over the sale of your brother. So for example, if someone offers a buyer who has agreed to purchase an item for like $10, you come and say, I'll sell it to you for $9. So I'm selling it, and we agree, or we're in the middle of the process, and he comes and says, whoa, I got the same thing for $9. So what happened to me? He's just undermined me. Similarly, it's forbidden to interfere with the purchase by offering a higher price to the seller. I'll pay you 10 for what you've agreed to sell for 9. The opposite way happens. Both parties, both practices, I should say, doing this or that are impermissible because they cause harm, and they're invalid if done during the option of withdrawal. during the time of khiyar al-majlis, or a stipulated option period. That's the khiyar al-shart we talked about before. Like, we're there, we're talking, we've kind of come to terms, and now I'm going to have to agree. And in that period of time, that's when somebody comes to undercut or undermine or overbid or whatever. During that case, you're causing harm to either the buyer or the seller. This prohibition extends to bidding on an item another Muslim has already bid for after the seller has explicitly agreed to the first bid. This is indicated in the hadith, do not bid against your brother. And this applies, of course, we're talking about bidding. This is outside the context of open public auctions. Like a public auction where I'm just taking bids for anybody that's here, as opposed to when I have already agreed to sell, sold, or I've got you, and then somebody comes in to try and underbid or outbid, undercut me or outbid me in some way after things have already gotten down to the point where we're getting ready to make a deal. We're getting ready to close the deal, I should say. In that case, you can't come and undercut or outbid. Once the option period is passed and the sale becomes binding, interference is no longer considered impermissible. Because the buyer or the seller, they have no legal room to rescind the transaction. It's already done. As we said, the transaction is concluded. Now, the sale is done. It's final. After we've gone through that process that was discussed earlier in previous lessons, the sale's done. If you come and try and say, hey, I got the same thing, I'll sell it to you for $9, well, that means you could buy another thing for $9, but you can't come back to me and say, hey, look, give me that item back, or I want to give you this item back. It's sold. It's done. Transaction is finished. Like, I'm gone. You call me up, hey, bring the car back. I got somebody that wants to pay more for it. Like, I sold you the car for $1,000, and it's gone off my driveway, and then somebody calls and says, wait, get the car back. I'm going to pay you $12. I really like the car. I'll pay you more. And then I go, hey, Tarek, come back with the car. I need it back, because he's going to say, you're like, sorry, dude, it's my car. I'm the owner now. Yeah, I mean, that's done. The same thing would go in the opposite way. If I'm buying something, somebody might try and sell me another thing, something for less. I just bought it, and somebody says, hey, I'll sell you the same car, but it's going to be for $800. The only thing you can do is go, okay, I'll buy that car too. At that case, it doesn't matter if anyone's trying to interfere, because the sale's concluded. So the attempt now to sell or to buy, it's open. It's open season, basically, is what is the concept here. This principle also applies to non-sale agreements, sale agreements, like rental agreements. It applies to the same thing. Loans, or even requests for employment or partnership, such that if one Muslim has already entered into a rental agreement or into an employment contract, it's forbidden for another to intervene and offer a competing deal during the option period. This would disrupt the established agreements and causes harm to the person that's basically secured the deal. Right, so it's not just the buying and selling, but it's the rental, it's the job, these types of transactions it also applies to. So that gives us an idea, a general concept of how we are to treat each other when it comes to these types of transactions. You have consideration for others. Buying and selling is not war. Okay, you're not going to war. While that may be an attitude that many in a very cutthroat economy, if that may be an attitude that you have in a very a commercialized society, it's not the attitude of the Muslim. Buying and selling is meant to be easy. It should be lenient. It should be understanding. It should be fair. It should be just. The interaction should be kind. That's how it should be done in Islam. There's some ethics here involved in buying and selling and transactions in general that are not always found in other frameworks and societies. All right. So the next section, the author addresses certain transactions with commodities that are subject to riba, usury. And before we look at it, a quick overview, which we can find in one of the main hadith on this subject, where the Prophet ﷺ, he said that gold is to be paid for gold, silver for silver, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, dates for date, and salt for salt, like for like, and equal for equal, like kind for like kind, equal amount for equal amount, payment made hand in hand, meaning done on the spot. He who makes an addition to it or asks for addition deals in riba. The receiver and the giver are equally guilty. Sunnah Nasa'i. So this is talking about riba, and it's two types. There's an-nasi'a and there's riba al-fadl. Nasi'a has to do with delayment of payment, and fadl has to do with increase in amount. Okay, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we get to their respected sections in the book. Right now we're talking about transactions that are invalid. And the transactions that are invalid have to do with ribawi commodities. Okay, so the concept here is, by the way, what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, gold and silver. This is a category, which is like currency. And then there's the other category of wheat, barley, dates, and salt. And this is a commodity which is storable, that is measured by either weight or volume. And while he did mention specific things, according to the madhab, it can occur riba of this type in anything that is measured by weight or volume. Okay, whereas others may say, no, it's specific to these particular food types. There are various different opinions there. So here Imam al-Bahuti says, وَمَنْ بَاعَ رِبَوِيًّا لَمْ يَجُزْ أَنْ يَعْتَاضَ عَنْ ثَمَنِهِ قَبْلَ قَبْضِهِ مَا لَا يُبَاعُ بِهِ نَسِيئَةً. So if someone sells a commodity which is riba, subject to riba, it is impermissible for them to exchange its price before it is taken possession of with something that cannot be sold on credit. What does that mean? This gets into the concept of selling the commodity with the same commodity at the same time. Okay? This applies to items which are weighed by volume, or are measured by volume or weight, sold for cash on credit initially, which is permissible to do. And the buyer then tries to exchange the cash that he's supposed to pay for an item which he cannot be sold on credit, like something from this category, something that is measured by weight or volume. So here, let's give an example. The seller agrees to sell 100 pounds of wheat for $200 on credit. It'll be paid in 60 days. You following me? 100 pounds of wheat, $200, 60 days. That's perfectly fine. I'd give you the wheat, and then I'll expect to collect in no more than 60 days. The buyer agrees to the terms of the sale, but when it's time to pay, he tries to exchange the $200 that he owes for a different form of payment, like 100 pounds of dates. He says, look, honestly, I don't have the $200. I couldn't sell it, or something happened to it, or I ate it. I don't know. I don't have the 200 that I owe you, but I do have 100 pounds of dates that I can give you instead. And they might be worth the same or more, who knows? This transaction is not valid because these products are susceptible to riba, and the delayed payment is not acceptable. Okay, so basically what he's highlighting is here is that when the sales transaction was initiated, it was a perfectly permissible transaction because we're not using the same category that has to be sold at the same time. If you want to sell these commodities that are weighed in volume, that are measured in weight and volume, they have to be done right then and there. I could sell you the barley for the dates, but it has to be an exchange right away. You say, look, I'll give you 100 pounds of dates for 100 pounds of barley. Okay, right now it's sold, done. But if you say, Ba'dain, I'll do it later, give me 30 days or 60, no, that's not permissible. You'd have to now mix the categories, the currency and the commodities. Then you could deal with time, etc. Delayment of payment, that's perfectly fine. So what happened is we started off in a good way. We said $200 for 100 pounds of wheat. And then we were going to end up concluding the sale, not concluding the sale, but finalizing the transaction in an impermissible way. So we're basically saying that this is not acceptable. You can't do that. You can't give the dates or give the rice or give the salt or give whatever in this case. You have to give currency. So you would have to go take those dates, if that's all you had, go sell them, liquidate, bring the cash, and pay. All right, that's one of the items. This is not something that we're going to find to be typical because we don't live in a society that trades in commodities. We deal in currency. So what would be more typical, or perhaps you could find as a loophole, he says, وَكَذَا شِرَاؤُهُ مَا بَاعَهُ بِدُونِ ثَمَنِهِ قَبْلَ قَبْضِهِ نَقْدًا وَعَكْسُهُ. He says, similarly, meaning similarly it's impermissible, buying back an item they sold at a lower price than its selling price before taking possession of the cash payment. Or its opposite, this is invalid. It's a little bit cryptic, right? It's codified to understand that. So the first type of transaction is known as bay'ul 'ayna. Okay, this is a type of transaction that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited. And it's a transaction or a sale where the seller sells an item to a buyer on credit, meaning a deferred payment, and then buys back the same item from the buyer for a lower cash price. And the transaction is typically used to achieve the equivalent of a loan with interest under the guise of trade. Like hiding it. It's concealed interest as trade. So here's a scenario to help, clarify what all that looks like. Zayd min al-nas. We got Zayd and who else do we have? Zayd and Amr, of course. Yeah. Zayd sells a car to Amr for $10,000 on credit. Payment due in 1 year. Follow along. Zayd sells the car to Amr for $10,000. Amr then sells the same car back to Zayd for $8,000 cash immediately. The result is that Amr received $8,000 in cash now, but owes Zayd $10,000 in cash in a year. The $2,000 difference is riba, essentially. That's what it's hidden in the transaction. That's the intent behind it. Because the intent is here, I need cash. That's the intent. I need cash, but I'm in a community where I can't find a lender for that type without, and nobody wants to charge interest maybe. It's like, it's a shame, or it's, like here, it's no problem. You don't have to do all that. You just go straight for it. Anybody will go for it. Muslims might even go, yeah, okay, you need $8,000? That's fine. Here's $8,000 in 1 year. You pay me $10,000. That's, of course, haram. But when you're in a scenario where, like, look, hey, we know it's haram to do that, to do that directly. So why don't we throw in a little something in there, like it's called a hila. It's known as a hila, which is it's a legal stratagem. It's like a strategy to get around, like a loophole. Like, let's set our nets out on Friday when we're not supposed to be fishing on the Sept, and then we'll collect the fish on the Sunday, right, trying to get around the prohibition. And so here, that's what you do. You say, look, let's put a car or a product in the middle. I'll buy it, and then you buy it right back. I'll take it on credit and you give me the cash, and then I'll pay you back that credit amount later on, and you'll get more money out of it at the end of the deal. So this is considered impermissible. It violates the principles of fair trade, of course. It falls into the category of riba. And of course, the hila, this legal stratagem, is meant to circumvent the prohibition of riba, which riba is explicitly forbidden in the Quran and the Sunnah. The second type, he says here, وَعَكْسُهُ, right? So if you look at this, وَكَذَا شِرَاءُهُ, buying back an item they sold at a lower price. Buying back an item they sold at a lower price. They sold the item for $10,000 on credit, bought it back for less before taking possession of the cash, so they didn't get the cash, because that's another thing we're going to talk about altogether, or the opposite of that. The second is known as reverse. It's called reverse aina, aks al-aina, which is similar to the first. It's just the mirror image of it. It's impermissible as well. Transaction begins with a person selling an item for immediate cash and then buying it back at a higher price on a deferred basis. And the goal again is to get cash and to pay riba, to pay a loan with a little extra on it. So it looks like this. Step number one, Zayd sells the car to Amr for $8,000 cash. $8,000 cash. Zayd repurchases the car from Amr for $10,000 on a deferred payment system to be paid later. Zayd, the buyer, effectively borrows $8,000 and must pay $10,000 back, resulting in a $2,000 interest-like gain for Amr, the seller. So you can see it's just the other way around. The end result is the same. You've gotten the cash and you're going to pay more in the future. The only thing that's in the middle there that's trying to fool or trick the system is a commodity, a car in this example. Right? So the concept here is the same. The core issue remains as it is. Essentially, we're trying to strike a ribawi contract here. All right, so that's the aksu. The next line he says, وَيَسِحُ, and this is the last line, وَيَسِحُ بِغَيْرِ جِنْسِهِ وَبَعْدَ قَبْضِ ثَمَنِهِ أَوْ تَغَيُّرُ الصِّفَةِ وَمِنْ غَيْرِ مُشْتَرِيهِ وَإِنْ اشْتَرَاهُ أَبُوهُ أَوْ ابْنُهُ جَازٍ. So this is going to give us the exceptions to that structure that we just looked at. We just looked at a structure whereas they're doing this transaction and it's a hila, right? It's a strategy. So there are some exceptions to this rule. So he says it's valid with a different type of commodity after taking possession of the payment, or if the item's form has changed, or if it is purchased by someone other than the original buyer, even if the purchaser is their father or their son. So there are 4 exceptions basically to this. The transaction is valid in both cases, either going forward or backward of that structure of ina or the reverse ina. Right? If it involves a different commodity than the original payment. So here, if we look at, instead of selling the car back for cash, Amr sells it back for another item. So Zayd sells the car to Amr for $10,000 on credit, due in a year. Amr sells the same car back to Zayd for a motorcycle right away. He didn't use cash. So the motorcycle transaction basically like saves the day there. So he sold the motorcycle. He sells the same car back to Zayd for a motorcycle. He got a motorcycle as opposed to cash. He still has to, and then the $10,000 is still pending. He's got to pay that off. Now you can do what you want with the motorcycle. So that in that scenario is permissible. So you could change the buyback, if you will, right, to a different. It can't be money. It could be another commodity. It looks like 2 sales in one, but it's 2 sales. Just the same initial commodity is used. But removing that cash element takes away that structure that gives you interest. Right? The motorcycle now, it is of something of value. You could either retain the motorcycle to use it, or you could sell it and have the cash. Similarly, it's permissible to purchase the item after taking possession of its price in the original sale, even if the repurchase of it is lower. So Zaid sells the car to Amr for $10,000 on credit. Once payment is made in full, Amr sells the same car back to Zaid for $8,000. The payment's been made. Done. Deal. Now he's just going to what? He's going to sell the car back to Zaid. And now it's more than likely going to sell it for less. It's a totally different transaction. There was no interest there. It's just money lost, basically, like, you know, the value of the car is depreciated, and so he's only able to sell it for $8,000. If he sold it for more, fine. If he sold it for the same thing, fine. But it is permissible even to do it at lower, because the typically lower price is what you would get the interest from, because there would be that $2,000. It's also allowed if the item has undergone a change or in form or characteristic such that a crafted item loses its specific function. So you could take that thing and resell it for cash, as long as that thing has now changed so much that it's no longer used in the same fashion. So like, here we go, follow this one. Zaid sells the car to Amr for $10,000 on credit. He's going to pay in a year. Then Amr resells that car back to Zaid to be paid in cash right away. But he took the car and turned it into a statue of a transformer robot, like Optimus Prime or Bumblebee. You know what I'm talking about? Optimus Prime. You know the transformer robots. They got the car, they turned into a robot. So he bought the car, and then he turned it into a robot and sold it back for $8,000. So he made $8,000, but he still owes the $10,000. But now we're not dealing, it's like a different commodity, basically. You've taken that commodity and you've changed it in such a way that it no longer functions as it initially did. The designed purpose of the car is a means of transportation. But you can take that and you can make it into a bed. Like they sell those plastic typically for kids. It's a hot rod bed. You know, it looks like a car, but there's a mattress. You could do that. You could take the car, rip all this stuff out, take the engine out, put a mattress in there and say, hey, look, it's a bed, designer bed, made out of a Mercedes-Benz. And then sell it back as almost as if it's a different commodity. The last one is valid to purchase the sold item from someone other than the original buyer, such as an heir or an heir of the original buyer. So, for example, Zaid sells a car to Amr for $10,000 on credit. Zaid sells a car to Amr for $10,000 on credit. Amr sells the same car back to Zaid's father for $8,000. And this is before payment's made. So there's a relationship here. Okay? This is permissible because of the third party, so long as they're not in collusion. It's not a hila. It says, yeah, we know about the hila. So to avoid that, I'll jump in as your dad, or I'll jump in as your son. And eventually, essentially, you're going to get what you want out of it. You'll either get the money you're looking for, or you'll get the interest payment that you're after. As a third party, if there's collusion involved, then no, it's not permissible. But if there's no collusion and it's just a third party sale, then it's permissible to do that even if there's some type of relation. Because typically when we think of those types of relationships, maybe not so much in the American context, but in the Muslim framework, is that it's almost like they're one and the same. Though not legally in terms of a dhimma, like they're the responsibilities, the burdens they carry, the things that they have to pay back. But like anta wa maluka li abik, for example, you and your wealth belong to your father. That type of thought is there. That look, I mean, they're relatives. You know, they're maybe in the same household. It seems too close for comfort, and it would be if they were colluding to get involved, but if they weren't, then it would be perfectly permissible, and that's where we end up for tonight. We wrap up. Jazakallah khair for your patience and your attentive listening. If you have any questions or concerns, you can certainly reach out, and if you're having issue with some of these points or dealing with them, I'd be more than happy to try and help work through them so you have a better understanding. جزاك الله خير وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وآخر دعوة.